Thank you. And again, thank you all for taking time out. It's a beautiful day for a hike, and I'm grateful that you're here instead to have what I hope will be a lively conversation. And it's an incredible moment to be gathered for a discussion about where sustainability is going. Some of you might think it's a difficult time, and certainly Jeremy Grantham gave us yesterday reasons to worry. But I think it's also a hopeful time. Yes, the IPCC has come out with its 1.5 degree report that would add to those reasons for worry. Yes, we're in a very fraught political moment in the United States with elections next Tuesday that I fear will add to the division rather than provide a pathway forward. But I want to share with you some reasons to believe that we are headed for a sustainable future. I'm going to outline 10 trends, 10 reasons to think that the sustainability megatrend is coming, even despite the challenges that we all know are out there. And reason number one is that people are no longer waiting for government to deliver the sustainable future. In the 20th century, one of the presumptions was that government was the key actor to deliver environmental progress. It was government that set the rules, established the regulations, figured out what companies might do, analyzed the problems, and told us what the answers would be. That is no longer what's happening, and that all of you are here is an example of perhaps the most significant other line of approach to environmental progress, and that is the changed role of business. 20th century, business was the problem, business was the enemy. 21st century, we understand that business can be a solutions provider. And particularly in a world where innovation matters, and I'm going to make that a central theme of my conversation this morning, in a world of innovation, business has a significant role to play. Which isn't to say that we can leave business on its own. Capitalism does not self-correct. One needs to provide guide points. But even more than you all being part of the business world, you're part of the world that's thinking about how to channel the flow of capital, channel the direction of business toward a sustainable future. And that gives me real reasons to think that we are on a sustainable trajectory. And by the way, it's not only the business world that's taken up this new challenge. The non-governmental organizations, the environmental groups, have begun to understand they too have to remake their approach to delivering sustainability, and many are doing so. Second of all, even to the extent that government is playing a role, and it continues to be important, it's not just the national governments. It's not Washington, which is fundamentally in deep trouble, but we're seeing real leadership from states, provinces, cities around the world. Mayors, governors, premiers have become the new leaders of sustainability. And in fact, this is an important trend not only because there is breakdown, at least in the United States at the federal level, but it turns out that those mayors and governors are often closer to the issues, closer to the people, and more accountable. And I think if you look just, for example, at the 2015 Paris Climate Change Agreement, you'll see a fundamental switch of gears. Those of us who worked on climate change in the 20th century, and I negotiated on behalf of the US Environmental Protection Agency that 1992 agreement, would recognize that the model of that time was top-down. We thought the answers would come from national governments. The Paris Agreement shifts that and says, no, top-down is not enough. You need broader engagement across many sectors of society, and again, across many levels of government, and you need to think about a bottom-up strategy because climate change is so big, so broad, and requires changed behavior on behalf of so many. So I do think the world is shifting in terms of understanding the broader shoulders on which sustainability has to rest, and we do see the mayors stepping up, not only in terms of their leadership on sustainability, but broadly coordinating with groups like C40, set up by Mayor Bloomberg, now originally with 40 big countries, big cities, now with more than 80. And likewise, the states are getting organized across the world. Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger helped launch something called the R20, Regions for Climate Change Action. And they too are holding conversations on a state and provincial scale, asking what it takes to deliver a sustainable future. Number three, information technology has transformed almost every sector of society, but curiously has had little effect on how we do environmental protection. So no business markets today the way it did 25 years ago. No baseball team picks players the way it did 25 years ago. We've all learned that you need to be data-driven and fact-based and more empirical. And just now, we're starting to see the possibilities of a more information-driven approach to environmental protection and of really understanding the potential for technology broadly to give us new strategies. And we have in the environmental arena, particularly in the United States, been stuck on a certain track for a very long time. Really almost no policy progress, no regulatory reform of any real note since about 1990. But I think that is beginning to change. We really do see lots of new infusions of knowledge, of science, of better approaches, of the learning of not just natural science, but social science on how to do the environmental work we need done. And that gives me a sense of optimism as well. Number 4, we are at a moment of big data opportunity. Big data has again become a factor in many aspects of our lives, and I think with its elements of artificial intelligence, of machine learning, we're starting to see a real set of new tools for delivering a sustainable future. Again, a number of you in this room are helping lead this revolution, providing us better ways of understanding which companies are on the right track and should have capital flow toward them from a sustainable finance point of view, and which are not, which are lagging, and might in fact present investment risks from which some investors will want to pull back. So I do think the capacity for measurement, the ability to understand where problems are getting better, where they're not, and for us to think more carefully about which investments of resources, both public and private, are helping deliver a sustainable future, and which are not, is starting to sharpen in focus. Number 5, and very importantly, the 20th century had a regulatory model where the government was responsible for everything. The government identified the problems. In many industries, it was the government that specifically spelled out what companies had to do through laws that were framed around the idea of best available technology being mandated by government and implemented by industry. We have in the 21st century the beginnings of a move towards a different regulatory approach, an approach focused on market mechanisms, on price signals, and fundamentally on making people pay for the harm they cause, the environmental harm, and perhaps even more broadly. But really, we're starting to see the emergence of what I call the shift to a world that has brought an end to externalities. So this is particularly important for those of you who are thinking about sustainable investing, because any business that has its fundamental marketplace success depending on, as so many did in the 20th century, externalizing costs onto the community or more broadly onto society, whether that's pollution going up a smokestack or underpaying workers or in any other way shifting burdens from the company's private account onto the community or the society's broader account, that business model will not hold. It's become too easy to spot those externalizing factors, and we're increasingly seeing companies being called to account for that kind of behavior. So I think we are going to see a very significant change. Movement away from a command and control strategy to price signals, to making people pay for their harms, and more broadly, this principle of there being no right to externalize costs. If you're seen to be doing that, you'll be asked to stop or to pay for the harm you're causing. And that changes incentives in very important ways. We also are in a world where the role of individuals, never mind business, has transformed. 20th century people thought of individuals in terms of their environmental impact as voters, and that's how they could shape the direction of environmental policy. We know today that's far too narrow a perspective. We now have individuals that are shaping the pathway to a sustainable future by their role as consumers, by their demand on companies to hear about the products and services they're selling, and to choose, in part at least, based on sustainability-based attributes. And even perhaps more significantly, and again at the focus of our gathering here over the last few days, is the role of individuals as investors. People are increasingly asking, what are the companies that I've put my money into, my portfolio, doing when it comes to sustainability? And the increasing demand from mainstream investors for better alignment between their values and their portfolios promises to be transformative, promises to change us in a very big way. In addition, every individual is today a watchdog, a potential force to call to account bad behavior. Every one of you with a cell phone can take a picture of a company that's misbehaving. United Airlines has still not recovered from the video of its crushing of that poor doctor who was trying to retain his seat and hauling him off an airplane. So any kind of corporate misbehavior is, in a world of transparency, at risk of going viral, and companies are now aware of that. The other element of individual empowerment that I think is worth noting is entrepreneurship, and really finding a growing number of the creative spirits across our society devoting their efforts to solving problems in the sustainability arena. Again, a number of you in this room represent that trend, but it's a much bigger, broader trend, beyond simply sustainable investing, to thinking about all the ways that new technologies, new financing tools, new public engagement strategies, new ways of looking at ESG data are going to help bring us into focus much greater ways to move towards a sustainable future. And again, I think that's helping spur innovation, which from my point of view is the key to a sustainable future. I call this talk From Red Lights to Green Lights because my view, as you've already heard, is that the 20th century approach to environmental regulation centered largely on government telling business what not to do. Stop, don't do that, red light, don't go there. And as everyone who's ever driven through an intersection knows, it's not enough to have red lights to tell people when not to go. You need green lights that tell people where to go and when to go. And we are not going to get to a sustainable future with a regulatory framework that simply tells people to stop and not to do certain things and to red light certain behavior. We must have a structure of green lights, of incentives. If we're going to get to a clean energy future, it won't be because companies were told what not to do. It won't be because people were told to stop certain things. It'll be because there is a structure of incentives, green lights, to get entrepreneurs encouraged, businesses of all kinds, steered toward delivering the elements of a sustainable energy future. Which brings me to two last points. One is, if we're going to have that structure of green lights, it's going to be fueled by money. And if I look back at my own work on environmental protection in the 20th century, I would tell you that among the many things we got wrong, among the many things we missed, was a misunderstanding of whether rules and targets were enough. So if you look back at the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change, it set out an aim to reduce emissions in the year 2000 to 1990 levels. But what we've learned is that kind of a target isn't good enough. Targets and timetables don't change behavior necessarily. In fact, to think that it was going to is what I call the lawyer's mistake. I can say that as a lawyer. But only lawyers imagine, if you write down a target and a timetable, that people are going to do things differently. Anyone in business would know, well, you've given a mission statement. You haven't even written the business plan. Never mind developing an action agenda to execute on that vision, on that target. So on my list of megatrends is the recognition now that we really do need to think about how to address changed behavior, and in particular, how to get money to the things we need to do to create a sustainable future. Beyond thinking in the 20th century that targets were enough, nobody spent time asking, where is the money going to come from to deliver on sustainability, to deliver on a clean energy future, to address the climate change problem? We now know that the money is important, and we know a second thing, that it won't be enough to have government put some money forward. Governments have far too little money. They put it into conservative choices. So the flow of private capital will be the key to a sustainable future. And again, that's where everyone in this room has a role to play. Sustainable finance is going to be the key to a sustainable future. The final of the trends that I spot is the missing focus in the 20th century on implementation, on delivering changes on the ground that deliver a different path forward. And I think we're seeing that as part of the 21st century. Already there's now much greater focus on testing success, not by how many laws were passed or how many people are acting, but what the air quality looks like, the water quality looks like, whether greenhouse gas emissions are coming down. So I do think we recognize now that execution matters, implementation matters, and I think we are seeing the progress that that new approach and that new emphasis is delivering. So let me close by saying that the challenges are real. This is a difficult moment. Those who called that out yesterday and the day before were not wrong, but it's also a moment of opportunity. We in this society are finding lots of ways to solve many different problems. And I think that same spirit of innovation, that same empowering of entrepreneurship, that same focus on big and new and fresh thinking and ideas can deliver a sustainable future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan, for those remarks. It's wonderful to hear about all those trends, which are all interconnected and supportive of building a sustainable future. Let's turn to a few questions that I have, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience, which are coming in through the app. We have several already lined up. So taking the megatrends you talked about as a backdrop, if you had to choose, which of these trends do you think is the most important to this, and why?
So these are all connected trends, so that's a hard question to pick one. But I think the idea that in the 21st century, businesses are not going to be able to have a business model centered on externalizing harm. That in any form, that's now being called out, and increasingly people are being made to pay for the harm they cause or to stop it. And I think the kind of second element of that is that we are seeing movement, slow movement, but I think it will accelerate in the years ahead towards a government strategy that is focused on price signals rather than command and control mandates. And I think that change promises not only to make it difficult for companies to have an unsustainable business model at the core, but I think it also promises, frankly, more flexibility in terms of regulation, more of the work being shifted from government figuring out the answers to the private companies being charged with coming up with solutions to problems. And frankly, it will spur innovation and I think give us a better response, a quicker response, a more innovation-oriented response to the challenges we face.
Okay. So this is beyond what government can fix, but it's also beyond what government can control, which leads me to my next question. How is the current administration affecting global efforts to reduce carbon emissions, specifically by their withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord?
So I'm going to stop you right there, because the United States has not withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accord. I hope you all know that. The Paris Climate Accord, by its own terms, says that no country, once having signed on, as the United States has, can withdraw until 3 years after the agreement has gone into effect. So the United States can't even announce its intention to withdraw until November of 2019, which triggers a 1-year negotiation of the terms of withdrawal, the first day of which, conclusion of which would be November 5th, 2020, which happens to be the day after the 2020 elections. So please don't go home saying to anyone that the US is withdrawn. It has not, and I think there remains a real question as to whether the US ever will withdraw. Second, it is true that the Trump administration is pulling back on a number of things that would have been part of the US climate change strategy. Notably, they have announced an intention to take down, undo the central thrust of the Obama administration's approach to climate change, which was the Clean Power Plan. And there's good news and there's bad news on that front. The good news is that the Obama plan can't simply be pulled down without something being put in to replace it. The legal framework of the United States, the administrative law framework, requires that a new administration propose an alternative. Now, one of the possibilities was that the Trump administration would attack the very idea that we need a regulatory framework for climate change at all. And that would require them to go not just to the Obama Clean Power Plan, but to something underneath it, which is the so-called endangerment finding that EPA undertook in 2009. The Supreme Court, by the way, had ordered the EPA, based on a question that had been brought to it, to look at the issue of climate change and to assess whether, under the Clean Air Act of the United States, there was an obligation to take on greenhouse gas emissions as a threat to public health and the environment. The EPA looked at that question and concluded, yes, greenhouse gases endanger public health and the environment and must be addressed in some way. So the Trump administration has done step one, saying we don't want to follow the Obama plan for addressing climate change, but it has not taken step two to undo the very issue around whether there is a problem with greenhouse gases. So I think the Trump team is now struggling with how to come up with a serious approach to greenhouse gas emissions, but one that goes in a different direction from the Obama Clean Power Plan. And just one last thought. If the alternative put forward turns out not to be a serious approach to climate change, it will be legally challenged. And again, the basic premise of administrative law in the United States is that federal agencies have quite a wide scope of discretion as to how to attack a problem, but they may not act in a way that is considered arbitrary or capricious. So if the plan put forward doesn't look serious to the courts, they will say, no, that is not a serious plan, that is arbitrary and capricious, go back and redo it. So there is a real issue about whether the US will follow through as the prior administration would have had us do, but I think it's going to be a little bit more difficult for the current folks to totally take down the track that we were on.
Mm-hmm. And as part of that, how their efforts balance out against the very strong market forces and the trends that you outlined, how do they balance out?
So I think that's another point here, is that government is not the only factor that shapes how we address problems. In fact, I think people believed in the 20th century it was such a big factor you didn't have to think about anything else. And I'm telling you all, I think you all must believe that what business does matters, what the non-governmental world matters, what investors do matters, and frankly, what markets are doing matters. So the promise of the current administration to restore coal as a central element of America's electric future is not going to happen. And I tell you that with great confidence, because it's not something the Trump team has any power to reverse. The trend away from coal is a function of much broader forces, including market forces, and frankly, the fast rise of renewable power at ever more competitive costs, the significant role that natural gas is playing in displacing coal as the fossil fuel power generation option of choice, are trends that aren't going to be reversed by any regulatory policy. So I think you're going to continue to see coal decline. There's not been a single new coal-fired power plant announced to be built in the country in the 2 years since President Trump won his election, and there won't be any. So the truth is the decarbonization trend is going to continue, not as fast as should be, not as fast as it could be, but it will not be reversed because the Trump team has been able to get coal-fired power back onto America's energy agenda.
Thank you for reminding us all that we can't believe everything we read on Twitter and, and hear on the radio.
Or what's promised in the middle of contentious political debates.
Right. All right, shifting gears a little bit and talking about young people. I have 2 teenage children back in Baltimore where I live, one of whom is going to be able to vote in 2020, and she's actually getting ready for it. As a teacher at Yale, you're around young adults all the time. I know you have 3 children yourself. What differences have you observed between the generations when it comes to interest in pursuing a more sustainable future?
So I think the reason that I see sustainability as an imperative and frankly as a mega trend that is occurring in any case is in part because there is a generational divide. People of our era, and I don't mean to quite put you in the same era as me,
We're very close.
but of our age bracket and era, saw this as a struggle and a challenge. And frankly, it's in our generation that a bitter political divide has opened up. If you look at the younger crowd, Democrats and Republicans, there's a much broader consensus on the importance of the environment as an issue, on the need to take climate change seriously, on how they've been raised to recycle without having to think about it, to think hard about waste. And I think that the kind of underlying values that have been absorbed and are now being reflected in political thinking as this younger world steps into positions of responsibility, including the responsibility as voters, represents, in my mind, a very big change. And the polling in this election is proving that. Among young people, there is a strong sense across party lines of the importance of sustainability. The interesting and difficult piece of this, the second element, is that young people still don't vote at anything like the numbers you might hope, given the importance of these issues and the urgency of bringing their voice to the political process.
It'll be interesting to see what next week brings on that front.
It'll be very interesting. There have been some significant efforts underway to get the young people out there, but I'm predicting for you with some sadness that the percent voting of the youngest part of our voting electorate is not going to be at the same levels as others.
Yeah, wait and see. Well, we're going to take a shift now and talk about some questions that we've received from the audience. Yeah, the list is long. Thanks for moderating this, Karina. Let's see, staying in the same focus on what an individual can do, there's a question from the audience. How have you been adapting your and your family's lifestyle in response to or in hopes of contributing to mitigating climate change? So your family, what your kids and you do, and what can we all do as individuals and as families?
So I think there's a couple of levels of that conversation. Level one is choices that we make every day about how to lead our lives. And I think all of us have the ability to begin to create the change that we want to see. So I've been driving an electric car for 5 years, and it is, I think, proven to be better than my old gas-powered car. It does mean you have to think a bit about getting charged up, but it turns out that that's a minor inconvenience, and in return you get the sense that every day you're contributing to at least a vehicle emissions-free passage to and from work. And I think each of us has to pick which elements of our own life can move, and then do it. The other thing that I would tell you, and this is going to probably jar the asker of this question, it's really important that we not have prescribed behavioral change. And in my own mind, one of the reasons we've had less success moving towards a sustainable future is because some people hear about this sustainability imperative and think of it as a likely direction towards less individual choice. So one of my other elements, and I had time only to go through my top 10 trends, but near that top 10 list, maybe in position number 11, would be a recognition that we should not be mandating behavioral change to individuals. We should invite people to choose the pieces of their life that they feel they can adjust. But the very fact of trying to mandate even things like no plastic bags, and I'm a big believer you should pay for the harm of plastic bags, but in a context like that, and this is something I have undertaken, encourage people to recycle their grocery bags. But don't forbid them to have plastic bags, because when you do that, you jar people and you anger them with a sense that being a good sustainability steward is going to be unpleasant and burdensome. And I think the 20th century sense that being good on the environment was going to be a pain was unhelpful. So I'm a big believer in a structure of policy that pushes us as quickly as possible to better behavior, but in a manner that provides some flexibility and choice and relies less on mandates and more, again, on price signals. I would be very happy if you had to pay 25 cents every time you took a plastic bag. And by the way, for some who say, well, that won't make enough change, people don't change behavior for 25 cents, that turns out to be wrong. One of the most important findings of recent environmental social science is that small price signals remind people of the behavioral preference towards sustainability, and a huge amount of behavior has been changed for very modest price signals. So it's a useful thing, even if the price is not fully compensating for the environmental harm.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up electric cars. I used to have one myself until I moved further out to the country and experienced range anxiety and had to trade in, but I'll get back to those electric cars.
Range anxiety is something we can solve, and people
Yes.
in this room should be investing in helping to build out a network of charging stations that would allow you, even from your more distant home,
Yep.
to be confident you can get powered up to and from work and on your weekend trips. So building out the infrastructure is one of the challenges. It is why sustainable finance is so important. There is a great need to flow capital to the underpinnings of a sustainable future and to overcome, and this is what academics love to talk about, the path dependence of the prior fossil fuel world. We know that there was $1 trillion worth of infrastructure put in from 1900 to 2018 in support of internal combustion engines. It's going to take some time to build that alternative underpinning for an electrified future.
Great. How many people out there have an electric car? I'm just curious.
Not enough, but thank you to those who are helping start the trend. And it does reflect that one of the other important elements here, and I probably stand a little apart from some who spoke yesterday, I think impatience with the pace of change is harmful, not helpful. And I would say another of my observations from 30 plus years is that every time someone stands up and says we must have change tomorrow, a significant part of the world, not the people in this room, but a significant part of the world, especially business people, hear that as, oh my God, I'm going to have to write off the capital I've invested in a certain approach to business, and in doing so, will suffer terrible losses. And if you jar that part of the world with answers that look extremely hard to follow and expensive and dislocating, you're going to find them seeking to derail the sustainability train rather than willing to get on it. So one of the things I think we have to think about is a policy framework that invites people to join the sustainability path towards the future and find ways to encourage them to come along rather than to jar them into thinking they can't be part of that sustainable future and they have to fight it.
Thank you. My city and county, this is a question from the audience, not mine. My city and county have recently passed resolutions to use 100% renewable energy for their operations by 2030 and for the community as a whole by 2042. How best might they raise funds to make investments to meet those goals?
It's a great question, and it goes to another of the key elements I think we need to have people in this audience thinking about, which is the innovation to deliver a sustainable future can't simply be technology innovation. It needs to be innovation in the finance of technologies and the deployment of clean energy in particular at scale. And one of the things that I think we have come to understand is that the prevailing answers to that question often are not good enough. So in many parts of the country, we have something called renewable portfolio standards that are doing exactly this, declaring that we're going to, on a certain trajectory, get to a certain percent clean energy by a date fixed. And the numbers here were what by 2030?
100% renewable. I can't pull it up.
100% by 2030.
100% by their, for their
So
own
here's the problem
operations.
with renewable portfolio standards, generally with that kind of a mandate in particular. It's good to have a target, but my question is, what's the pathway? What are you doing to actually create a structure that gets you there? And it turns out this is where we really do need creative finance. One of the things that I concluded when I was commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, that the old incentives to encourage the build-out of clean energy infrastructure were too small and too slow. Connecticut had clean energy financing where if you put a solar array on the roof, you could get a rebate for half the cost. But that was basically no leverage, or little leverage. $1 of private money was being, $1 of public money was leveraging $1 of private money. Not good enough. So in Connecticut, we launched a green bank, and that green bank has done a whole lot of things to use limited public resources to leverage private capital. And that's the kind of finance innovation I think is required to get where we need to go, to get that kind of ramped up approach to clean energy. Another of the things that people have gotten wrong was thinking that, again, a target would actually create projects that were financeable. Not true. What we really need are power purchase agreements that allow those who are building renewable energy infrastructure to get contracts, commitments for 10 or 15 or 20 years that allow them to go to a bank and be able to get a loan. Now, currently, if you were in the state of Connecticut before I was there, and you came into a bank and said, I'd like to borrow $100 million to build a wind farm, and oh, by the way, the state of Connecticut has promised that by 2020, it'll be 20% renewable power, so there's going to be a market for my wind power, the banks would say, I'm sorry, that Connecticut has a target out there is not enough for us to lend you money. But if you do what we did in Connecticut and launch a reverse auction so that the potential builders of clean energy projects can compete by offering the best projects at the lowest prices to ratepayers, and the winners get 15-year contracts. With that, you go to the bank and they'll lend you $100 million, because you now have a contract, not just the distant promise that somebody hopes to be 20% renewable, or in this case, 100% renewable.
Great, thanks. You raised the concept of an end to externalities, and there's a lot of questions from the audience about externalities. Can businesses really implement self-policing and accountability to limit externalities? For example, can fossil fuel companies really be expected to internalize their externalities without political will and regulation?
So the answer to that is that almost certainly government does need to play a role, and I think all of the folks in this room need to play a role. So governments, in an ideal world, would put a price on the harms equal to the harm, and at that point, if fossil fuels are fully paying for not only the greenhouse gas emissions, but their local air pollution, and frankly, for the damage caused in exploration and transportation, I think you have incentives for care, incentives for energy conservation, and big incentives for people to think about alternative ways to get that energy into the marketplace that don't have to pay these harm charges. So I think you'd have a big incentive for a transformed future. So I would like to see a government strategy that moves towards making people pay for the harm. And I don't think we will get there as quickly if government doesn't play that role. But having said that, it is a second best alternative, but still a useful thing for those that are steering capital to be able to say to their investors, oh, by the way, these companies are doing more to address climate change, these are doing less. And frankly, even more than that, to say, the world is changing. We're moving towards a sustainable future. We're moving towards there being a price on harm. We're moving towards a decarbonized future. And this set of particularly fossil fuel companies, coal companies top of that list, are carbon exposed. And I don't think you want to invest in them, because there is a real risk that if not in the short term, in the middle term, they will have a harder time succeeding in the marketplace, be less profitable than some alternatives. So although a government price signal is the best way to drive change, private market signals can be important as well.
Okay. There's a question on blockchain, which I think there's a segment on in the program during this conference. How do you see blockchain technology fitting into addressing sustainability issues, and do you have any specific examples?
So I think blockchain still remains to be proven in terms of how well it's going to support some of the passageways to a sustainable future that we're talking about. And I worry about the energy consumption that is behind blockchain technology. So I think there's going to have to be some innovation in terms of blockchain. But I do think there is some promise in the tracing and tracking capacity of blockchain, particularly for supply chain sustainability. And a number of companies have begun to take not just cognizance of, but responsibility for the sustainability issues in their supply chains. And I think some chain of custody tracking through blockchain may allow us to understand in a cleaner, clearer way who's producing what and where, and what elements of that are sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Somebody out there in the audience wants to give you $1 billion. They're calling it your Green Light Fund. So congratulations on that funding.
Excellent. Very pleased.
With that money, what should this incentivize? What's the priority? And how about for the next $100 billion that you get?
So first of all, I'm very pleased about the billion that's being offered. And I would tell you, even more broadly, we might ask, where has our current structure of money flowed, and why, for example, have we in this country, and very few others outside this country, made a bet, a huge bet, on a clean energy future, betting 20 billion federal dollars on one answer to the clean energy future. Does anyone know what that is, that we've bet 20 billion US dollars on? I think I hear someone saying it. Corn-based ethanol. We bet 20 billion US dollars on corn-based ethanol, which is one of the worst ways to incentivize a clean energy future. Just bids up the price of corn, creates a food-fuel trade-off, takes 3 units of fossil fuel inputs to get 4 units of ethanol out. So it turns out there are bad ways to spend your money, even if it's a green light to something that seems like a clean energy option. So if I had my $1 billion, I would actually spend it on implementing technologies that would allow us to scale up the existing renewable power options. And in particular, we are not seeing the uptake of wind and solar power as quickly as we could because we do not have batteries that allow us to store that power and deal with the intermittency of wind and solar. And frankly, we don't have a smart grid that's as efficient as it could be in terms of helping to shave peak load so that we don't have to build a whole lot of power plants for a few hours or a few days of peak electricity demand. So we could be much better off if we spent more money, not on wind and solar specifically, or tidal power, or wave power, or biofuel, next generation power, but on improving the market delivery and deployment of existing technologies. So again, smart grids, smart appliances, the ability to be more efficient with the power we have, as well as, in particular, better batteries or storage to allow these power sources that have an intermittency issue to go to scale.
We have a couple of other energy.
I'll be waiting here off stage at the end of my talk for that $1 billion check to arrive.
A couple of other energy-related questions. Oil and gas have the ability to raise capital through advantageous corporate structures, including MLP, but not alternative energy entities. How can there be parity with this policy?
So this is a really important point, and it goes to another area of activity, which is the kind of hidden opportunities for better policy. And there's 2. One of them I do think is, what is the tax structure and things like the master limited partnership opportunities for alternative energy? And we have not created these structures in quite the same way, and yet I think this could be done. I think as part of a package of market-based strategies for driving capital to help solve sustainability problems, you could get out of our Congress in Washington, with Democrats and Republicans supporting it, frameworks of the kind that's being suggested there. The second of these options that I would tell you exists is rethinking the business model of our electric utilities, which requires transformed public utility regulation, which is the most important and underattended to area of regulation that I know. In fact, I teach my students, if you really want to make a difference in the world, you should aspire not to be an environmental group leader or a congressperson or even a sustainable finance expert, but you should aspire to be the chair of a public utility regulatory authority in one of the 50 states. And the opportunity there to set out frameworks that would redo how every electric company, every power generator, every transmission and distribution company does its work would be huge. And frankly, we have the potential in that regard to get a number of these companies to carry the clean energy agenda, to invest in energy efficiency, to take seriously the opportunity to deliver clean energy across a smart grid. But we aren't there yet because the existing infrastructure, the existing utility business models haven't been transformed.
Okay, shifting gears a little bit. If we now must rely on consumers and investors for enforcement to limit externalities, how do you square that with increasing polarization, disinformation, and corporate political spending?
So I would say that the reality, at least in the United States, of unlimited corporate spending in politics is a real threat to the ability to transform markets through private party action, including consumer, investor, and even business response. So I think the premise of that question does raise a very tough challenge. But having said that, I think there are ongoing opportunities for transformation. Because one of the other things that our recent social science of environmental protection tells us is that you can change markets without everybody being part of the change. In fact, often 10% of the consumers in a particular arena, and almost certainly 20% demanding a cleaner, sustainable alternative, can tip the market, and suddenly you find everybody is asking for that cleaner alternative. And it turns out that no one in the business world wants to give up 10 or 20% of the market completely, and therefore they're likely to track trends towards an environmentally preferable option. And this has been demonstrated in a number of categories, beginning with, by the way, something as simple as tuna fish. 20 years ago, there was a big debate over whether dolphins were being killed in the way certain tuna was caught in the eastern tropical Pacific Ocean. And Bumblebee concluded that they could stop buying that tuna and then put a little sticker on its can that said dolphin safe tuna. And it turned only 10% of the market, but every other tuna maker matched, because you couldn't afford to be the dolphin killing tuna in the market. And so everybody said, no, we'll go to that sustainable approach. And it transformed the market very, very quickly, even though only a small percent of the public had really gotten onto that as a critical issue.
Okay, thank you. We're running into our last 5-minute segment, and I know something you have written about is about leadership, and where do you look to for leadership, whether it's corporations or in the political realm or really anywhere else in terms of helping move this sustainable movement forward?
So I actually think leadership is required in many realms, and so I wouldn't look in any one place. I wish we had better political leadership, but I think, as I've said, the political arena is only one arena through which sustainability could be delivered. I do think the business community has a number of leaders, many leaders, who are taking sustainability seriously. And so I think there's big opportunities to see corporate CEOs and other leaders step up and demonstrate pathways to a sustainable future. And I think a growing number of those corporate leaders are finding their efforts taken seriously and rewarded. I do think the investor movement to take sustainability on is huge, and I do appreciate all of you who are leaders in that arena helping to steer capital in ways that I think are fundamental to the prospects of a sustainable future. And I do think we need leaders who are bringing this 21st century thinking to the non-governmental community, to city-scale activity, to state and local regulatory activities. So I think leadership is got to be very broad-based. And I would say what I'm most interested in encouraging is not a certain set of leaders, but broad leaders, but ones who are willing to be innovative. Again, perhaps the most profound point of learning in all of academia in the last 50 years is that innovation is critical in every element of society, business, investing, and certainly for sustainability. And if innovation is critical, one of the things we need to think about is how do we encourage leaders who have the vision to bring into their work things like sustainability as a critical factor, and then the ability to execute on that vision. So I think those who are really in a position to deliver change are the ones who are going to make the difference. And that's the key leadership trait that I'd be looking for across all of these sectors of society.
All right, there's a question here about Yale and their 403B plan. I'm not sure if this is putting you too much on the spot, but Yale just changed the offerings in its 403B plan, and the questioner says that the result is that Vanguard index funds are at the core of its default and dominant offerings, and they are not ESG based. What is your reaction to that, and are you doing anything to put any pressure to change that?
So this is actually, again, an interesting and important issue. And Yale has just changed its approach, and it's done something very good for the average professor or staff member at Yale who pays too little attention to their investing and will now have default options that are much smarter than they might have picked in the past. So that's a good thing. What's difficult and what's unfortunate is if you don't have other values, not simply better returns, but more sustainable futures factored in as an option as well. So I did raise this issue recently with the folks from TIA, but they pointed out that it's not their choice, that it's actually Yale that negotiated it. So even universities that think of themselves as on the forefront of sustainability have to understand that it's not enough to have a School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. You have to live sustainability in other aspects of your life. And I think that's a lesson for all of us, and one, frankly, that we at Yale are not yet good enough at.
Yeah, and I think we can all look to our own organizations in that way. Thank you for that. On that note, we will wrap up, and thank you, Dan, very much for sitting in the hot seat for so long here and for sharing your thoughts with us. And thank you to the audience. Thank you.